Good morning. My name is Marisela Tenorio Bocangel. I'm a student at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City. And today we're here as part of a special project for my history class about the Holocaust with Professor Gwendolyn Alexis. I'm going to interview Rosalie Ocean, and she's going to share with us the history of her family. Both of her parents were sent to concentration camps by the Nazis during World War II. And without further ado, I would like to introduce her so she tell us her story herself.
Thank you so much for inviting me to share my parents' story. It was really a privilege to meet this morning and see how we're going to introduce the story of my parents. My parents were citizens of Romania, and my mother was from a small town called Halmu in the northern area of Romania. My father was from a smaller town called Glod. They did not know each other before the war. My mother lived with her parents and her 4 brothers. Her father was a metalsmith and her mother was a homemaker. And they worked very hard and they toiled. In 1944, the Nazis came to their town, and my mother and her entire family was deported to Auschwitz. And she was very quickly separated from her brothers and her parents, and she never saw them again. So that's the beginning of her story. My father was inscribed into a labor force earlier, and he was on different slave labor details, building the train tracks for the Nazis so that they could expedite their deportation. He survived the war with his 2 brothers, and the rest of his family was killed in the war. His parents, however, had died beforehand. So that is a very brief story of their beginnings and their experience with the Nazis coming into their town. I wanted to go a little bit back because I was speaking before about the concept of justice and what that means in terms of being able to commit genocide. The Nazis created laws to justify what they were doing. Laws that were not just, but were declared just. They had the Nuremberg laws in the beginning, in 1935, and that began to separate the Jews from the Germans, and then that evolved into the final solution, which is the complete extermination of the Jewish people. So within those years, a lot happened in many parts of the country, in Romania and also Hungary and Poland and many areas in Central Europe and other reaches to actually commit this genocide, in which millions and millions of Jewish people were killed and other people were killed as well. So that's a little bit of a background. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about my mother's story while she was in Auschwitz, and then my father's story.
Maybe you want to show her picture so they know
Yes.
who your parents were.
Yes, okay. So we have a book here. This is called the Newman Family Book. It was written by cousins. A cousin actually is very involved in the generational research of the Newman family, and she created a tribute book of all the Newmans. There were many, many Newmans in my mother's generation, and this is the page of my grandparents, Fischl and Serena Newman, who were killed in Auschwitz, and these are my parents, Alex and Frieda. And Frieda was born to Serena and Fischl. So she is the woman that at a very young age, 14 years old, was deported, and her 4 brothers with her and her 2 parents they were all killed, and she was the sole survivor of her family. And so these are them as they were younger, and then here is a picture of them when they were older. You can see that they are Orthodox. My father is an Orthodox Jewish man, my mother also Orthodox, and these were much later, a much later picture. My father survived the war, came to the United States with Frieda, and he lived until the age of 67. My mother lived until the age of 72. They had 8 children, and many, many grandchildren and great-grandchildren. May they rest in peace.
Maybe do you want to show them the picture of your grandparents that died in Auschwitz, right?
Yes. Okay. So these are my my grandparents. This is Fischl and his wife Serena, and this was their engagement picture, because so much was confiscated when they were deported. There are virtually no pictures of them later, maybe 1 or 2 taken by others. So this is their picture when they were younger, and they were, in 1944, they were obviously older, and when they were deported. So the story about my parents is one that I have lived with my entire life. As a very young girl, we understood that my parents had a very difficult beginning. My mother had a tattoo on her arm. That number was A9107. So when she was deported to Auschwitz, she was sent to Birkenau, which was the labor camp in Auschwitz. She luckily survived, surely because others saved her. She was very thin and slender, and she was actually going to be exterminated. One of the guards came into the barracks where she was with a group of people from her town, some women, and they took her out. They wanted to send her to the gas chamber. And her friends, who were older and stronger than her, they said to the guard, "If you take her, you have to take us." And they were good workers. And by sheer fate, the guard had compassion and said, okay, she could stay. And that is how she survived the first time. Another time she survived is through her sheer strength of the love of her mother. She was separated from her mother immediately when they arrived in Auschwitz, and her father and her brothers. She never saw them again. And one of the things she said to me was, there were days when she was so hungry, she didn't know if she could survive another moment. And she had dreams at night that her mother was feeding her.
Wow.
Feeding her the food of their country, of their culture. And she said to me that that sustained her, the times when she could no longer go on. She worked in the fields as a laborer, and she also worked in a munitions factory. Every day they would take the women to this factory, and she was forced to work there. And her job was to put powder in bullets. And she doesn't talk a lot more about her experience there. She was there from 1944 till January 1945, when the Germans put her on a death march so they could evacuate the concentration camp. They wanted to actually destroy a lot of their evidence of what they had committed, and so she walked on that march for many, many days, and she didn't talk much about her experience then. There was a lot of trauma, so that was a very difficult story for her to even share. My father's story is a little different because he was constantly working and laboring, and it was him and his 2 brothers. They were mostly together, and they saved each other's lives from time to time, sharing whatever food that they could find, and just sustaining one another until they were liberated. My mother was liberated by the Russians, and she was going to be taken to Russia. That was the goal, to bring everyone back to Russia. And she and a group of her friends jumped train and decided to go home. When she went home, she learned that no one in her family survived, that she was alone, and she went to the home where she was born and saw that someone else was living there. She sat down on the steps and she just waited. She describes it as just sitting there and waiting. She didn't really know what she was waiting for. And then another person in the town saw her and said, "Oh, you are here. I will get some of your cousins from another town to come and get you." And so cousins from another town came for her and took her to where they lived. And that's where she stayed until she was set up with my father on a, they were like a couple of surviving men, and they quickly, met up, and she married my father. She had 2 children while she was still in Europe. She went to a displaced persons camp where they waited to come to either Israel or the United States. And she had relatives here in this country who sponsored her, and she and my father and their 2 children came here by ship, and they came to the Lower East Side. And that's where they began a new life. She and my father had 8 children. My father had a very hard time making a living. They were not skilled, they were not trained, because obviously they didn't have any schooling. Their life was interrupted. My father first tried his hand at being a mechanic and a winemaker. He couldn't drive, so he didn't know how to fix cars, and he didn't know how to make wine. My father tried other things, and then my mother taught him how to bake, and he became a baker. And from that, they had made a living all their life. First, they owned a few bakeries. They started out with one and then built that business. Unfortunately, they did not make such good decisions. They didn't understand the population shifts, and they opened up kosher bakeries in areas where they were no longer needed, and so they unfortunately went bankrupt. He finally did get a job as a baker and worked as a baker until his retirement. My mother, a baker and also a housekeeper and homemaker. So that was a very brief story, but I want to go back a little bit and share some of the books in my library.
Mm-hmm. And Rosalie, you said your mother went to Auschwitz, and
yes.
Your father was in 3 different camps?
He went to different camps. He went to Madlenburg and Majdanek, and he also said that he was in Auschwitz, in Dachau.
Oh, okay.
But he was on this constantly moving. They were moving him. He was being driven by the Nazis as a laborer, and it was very difficult for him. He wasn't a strong man, but he and his brothers they had this tremendous will, and I think because they were together, they survived, one for the other. But he describes a very difficult time because he was married before. He had a wife and 2 children, and he only started sharing this later in life. As you could see, I didn't even introduce it in the story, because it was later that he shared it with his family, that he had a wife and 2 children, and they were deported, and he never saw them again. And we tried to ask him the name of his first wife, the name of the children, but he wasn't able to share it. It was a tremendous trauma for him, and it rarely came up. So that was his hardship, very difficult. He was very sad in those stories, but he built his life around it.
Do you know about what happened with your uncles? They stay in Europe or they came here too?
My two uncles stayed in Europe after the war. They stayed for a very long time, and then eventually they went to Israel. They went to Israel in the 60s. So they actually stayed in Romania for quite some time, and they were in touch frequently with us, with my father. They made some calls, and then finally they were reunited. My father hadn't seen his brothers in many, many years, and in the 1970s, in the late 70s, his older brother came to Brooklyn, and they met for the first time in a long time, and that's the first time that I had met one of my relatives. So I think the thing that is most difficult for me in this experience is knowing that two people that I cared and loved very much had suffered so much in their early life, but also not having relatives, not having grandparents and aunts and uncles. We were very much alone, coming here very much alone. We only had our parents as a frame of reference to the story of our lives and our roots. So in a way we were like trees that had branches, but we had no bark and no roots. And so we always say that my parents had to create their own roots for their family.
Mm-hmm. Earlier you shared with me the wish of your mother before she passed to go back to your country.
Yes. My mother was diagnosed with cancer, and when she was she had one wish, and she wanted to go back to Romania, to the town of Helmu, also known as Holmein, where she was born. She wanted to see the house that was taken from her, the house that she had to leave. She was forced to leave by the Nazis. She wanted to go back. So two of my sisters and I made the arrangements that she could return. So we took her, it was a difficult journey because she was sick at the time, but tremendously strong. We went to Hungary, and then we drove to her town. We stayed overnight on the border of Romania and Hungary. I wrote a story about it, which is in the book, in the Newman book. And she saw her home. We went there together. We knocked on the door. She remembered it. We knocked on the door, and this man answered. And our driver was the translator, and told him why we were there. So we just wanted to see the home. She didn't want to go inside. She just wanted to go to the garden, because that's where she spent a lot of time when she was a child. And we spent a few hours in the town. We had lunch there. We brought our kosher lunch, and we had it there. And she talked to one or two people. One woman she remembered, an elderly lady. So she went to her garden and spoke to her a little bit. And then we went back to Hungary, and we took her home. And I think that was a very big transition for her. It fulfilled her lifelong wish. And it also fulfilled a wish for us, that she could tell us her story firsthand. We also went to the cemetery in Helmu, where she was able to visit her beloved grandparents, who she remembered as a young person. And went to the graves. It was very hard to find the tombstone, but a woman who watched the graves, she came with us with a bucket of water, and she started to scrub down the tombstones with a brush, and so that we could read the headstones to see where her grandmother was. And we finally found her. We prayed there. We lit a candle, and we had that memory and that story from her.
Mm-hmm. And you have something here, like a book,
yes,
that you want to show us?
Yes. So a lot of the towns that were where the Jewish communities were destroyed, they have written memorial books. The survivors and the children of survivors wrote memorial books of the town. This is called L'Skor Kahilot HaKodesh, to remember the sacred community of Halmu, and it talks about the citizens of Halmu. Whoever they could remember and write about, they did. Pictures of people in classrooms, children studying, professions, what people did for livings. Were they shochat, which is a ritual slaughterer? Were they a butcher? Were they an innkeeper? Were they teachers, rabbis? They are in this book.
This is written in Hebrew. Okay?
This is written in Hebrew, and I have some translation in English that I was able to get. And I could just read a little bit of what happened in this town. The book talks about life before the Nazis came in, and then during, and then after. And this is about March 1944. The Nazis came into Halmu in a big parade, and they created rules and edicts against the Jews. And just after a few days passed, they confiscated all the valuables. The Nazis took Jewish people at gunpoint and locked them in buildings. A month later, in April, the Jews were not able to have non-Jewish housekeepers, and they were only allowed to walk in the streets during the hours of 9 and 10 a.m. That's 1 hour a day. Their radios, phones, vacuum cleaners, silver, sewing machines, cameras, paintings, and carpets were confiscated, and they were told that Aryan people can no longer associate with them anymore. All the men, except for the old men, were taken to a working camp inside the country and outside the country, and no communication was allowed between them and their families. Jews and Christians were totally separated, and all the remaining Jews were put in a shul, in a synagogue, to await transport to the ghetto Selish, and after that to concentration camps. The Jews were not allowed to get any tickets for anything that they needed, such as shoes or food. And at the ghetto, they were given 2 potatoes per person to live on. There was no way to describe the horrors of the Jewish destruction by the Germans. Jews were destroyed and chased from the country. The Germans obeyed orders and did not follow common sense. All pleas by rabbis and church clergy did not have any effect. Everything was done brutally and not concerned at all for the sick and the elderly and the children. In the ghetto, no one was allowed to go out or come in. They could not even go amongst themselves within the ghetto. So in the Selish ghetto, sometimes the Nazis would take the heads of the families in front of the other family members, and they would be tortured. So they should tell where the family valuables were hidden. The Jews of Helmine were put on a death train, and there were 80 people to one car on that train. They locked the cars, they gave 1 bucket of water, and most people wound up killed. As soon as they got off of the trains in Auschwitz, they were sent to the gas chamber. Others were tortured and died of hunger and disease. And after the Holocaust, what happened? This book talks a little bit about how the Red Army liberated the Jews, and they were faced with a lot of problems where to go. Some Jews went back to their original cities where they came from, hoping to find other family members who survived. Most found that their homes were destroyed or taken over by other people. the book says the houses were like skeletons, as though there was nothing left. This one person in the book describes how he walked through the main synagogue, which was empty and abandoned, and all the Jewish books were gone. It's a very sad time, and we all can imagine, all the Jewish souls that were killed, that disappeared, and mainly there were ghosts of people. So this is a little bit about, what this book talks about. In this little town, there were 2,500 people. 400 families lived in this little town, and very few survived. My mother was one of them. So I tell you this story because I live my life with this story in my life. This book, A Promise of a New Spring, is one that I hold near my bedside. It's about the Holocaust and renewal by Gerda Weissman Klein, and really it's about hope. So here's the end of this book. So are the few human survivors of the Holocaust. They have an important task now: to build a new life, to remember what the world was like before so much was destroyed by evil, to repeat their memories, to tell their story to children and to grandchildren, to all who will listen. Listen well to the tale of what they have seen, what they have gone through, for you are the new spring in the forest of the world. So that's this book. And another very meaningful book is I Am a Holocaust Torah, that we got when we went to Europe. My husband and I went on a separate trip to Europe. We wanted to go to the concentration camp where my mother lost her family, where my grandparents and my uncles were killed. So we went to Auschwitz first, and we saw the barracks where my family was, and these are the tracks going to the entry to Auschwitz and Birkenau, and then my husband and I we lit a memorial candle, and we put the names of our deceased relatives into it, and said a prayer, a memorial prayer in their memory. And this was for my mother who could not go to Auschwitz. She refused.
She refused to go there.
Yeah, she couldn't. When going home was one thing, but going there, she said she would never set foot in Poland. She would never go to Germany. She said, but going to Romania, she was going to go there. But my dad didn't go at all. Couldn't. So for me, the background, my parents' story is really a story for me for my whole life. But it's not my own story. It's not special. It's something that happened to them. It's a tremendous tragedy that happened to them. It's part of the history of the Jewish people. But it's a bigger story. It's a part of a history of a lot of people who suffer atrocities in the countries they live in, countries they come from. My husband and I have visited Cambodia, and we saw what happened there to the people there, and they also are setting up memorials. It's important in my life to know my story, because it informs me a lot more about the world through my story.
And there's something else that you want to share with something like important that you think you left out about your parents, or you think that that's all?
Well, something very important happened to people. People came out of these horrible tragedies, and they took directions in their life. Some, unfortunately, never overcame the trauma and could not really function. Some did their best, came out as whole as they could with a lot of brokenness. There's a saying, there's nothing so whole as a broken heart. And in brokenness we could find this story of recreating, of renewing. And my parents, they were tremendous people in faith and courage.
And that takes me to the question that I wanted to ask from you now. Like, I met you as a chaplain or rabbi, right?
Yes.
So I wanted to know if that important work that you do as a spiritual guide to a lot of people that need you, if you think that that is an influence of what happened with your parents, or has nothing to do with this?
It has everything to do with it. I work in hospice care. I work with people who are very sick and are destined to die sooner than later. And many people in my story died without comfort, without care, without honor and dignity. They were just simply gassed and their bodies burned or buried without a prayer, without anyone holding their hand. And the work that I do is just to be able to give the support, spiritual support, the love and compassion to people who are suffering. No one should die alone. No one should be tortured. No one should be deprived of the dignity of a burial, of a proper burial. And my people have been deprived of that. And I try and help families through this, through the process of it, and know that they are not alone. I and my teams of hospice workers. So my work is totally about the dignity of a human being. Respect and dignity, no matter the culture, the faith. We come in with whatever culture and faith this person is, with honor and respect and dignity. Because if we can't give that to a person, then we are not human beings. And the Nazis were not human beings.
So, Rosalie, I wanted to thank you for the opportunity. This is the second time that we're meeting. And you know our circumstances, how we meet. And I want to thank you for giving me your time to share the history of your family, and also because of the spiritual support that you are going to provide my family. So I wanted to finalize this interview by saying that I hope that this history, shows the people that they still did not believe the Holocaust happened, and like an honor to all the people like perished there, or survivors and their families, and let's hope that this kind of history, genocide, anti-Semitism, and hatred, to stop and does not repeat itself in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay.